Hello, Taos County. Darian Fernandez, your Taos County Democratic Party chair. And as part of our effort to make sure that people are informed, educated, and involved in the election cycle this year, we are bringing interviews with several of the candidates who we were not able to schedule forums with. I have with me today a candidate, Joseph Maestas, for a very important position in the state of New Mexico, Public Regulation Commission. And I'd like to ask him a few questions, but first give him a chance to introduce himself.
Hi, Taos County Democrats. Joseph Maestas here, candidate for Public Regulation Commission. I just want to first say that I hope that all of you are safe and healthy, and the same goes for all your family. These are some really difficult times, and I think this pandemic and coming out of this pandemic will certainly be, partially in the realm of the Public Regulation Commission as it pertains to utility disconnection and utility bill payments. So, more about that later. But I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity for me to address you. My name is Joseph Maestas, but I want to say that I'm the right candidate at the right time. Why? Because the state right now is poised to be a national leader in a transition to a clean energy future through the enactment of the Energy Transition Act, but more work needs to be done. That path to a clean energy future, that ultimate goal to help have carbon-free energy by 2045 for investor-owned utilities in 2050 for co-ops, it's not that clear. We have an electric grid that needs to be modernized. It really can accommodate a mix of renewable energy. We have, I think the PRC as an organization needs to be reformed. So there's a lot to do to prepare our state to make that transition smoothly. So it's going to take someone with the most qualifications, the most experience, and the most leadership. I am an engineer by training. I'm licensed to practice engineering in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I'm a retired federal engineer and regulator. I spent over 30 years serving our country as a federal civil servant. And during that course, I implemented a whole host of federal regulations like the Federal Aid Highway Act and National Environmental Policy Act and a whole host of other regulations. So I'm accustomed to the federal rulemaking and federal regulation through my profession, as a federal engineer. But today, I currently work in the private sector. So I bring public sector experience and private sector experience. I work for a private consulting engineering firm. I do business development, project management, and client management. And I work in a lot of areas and have worked in a lot of areas that are under the PRC umbrella, like transportation, like water resources, and asset management studies, and renewable energy feasibility studies. So I bring that past regulation related experience. I'm a trained problem solver. I also, as many of you know or don't know, I served as a local elected official for 14 years. And I served 10 years as a Espanola City Councilor and Mayor, and 4 years as a Santa Fe City Councilor. And I must say, all these governing bodies are quasi-judicial, similar to the PRC. We hear appeals from planning and zoning commissioners, so we operate in that function. And then lastly, I have the leadership experience to really hit the ground running, having been a mayor, having worked with other elected colleagues on these governing bodies, having led organizations like the New Mexico Municipal League and New Mexico Voices for Children. So I've got this leadership experience. And I think the main thing that sets me apart from my opponent is that I'm publicly financed. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that later, but I am not receiving any private sector donations because I refuse to be beholden to special interests and big donors. So I've got the experience, the leadership, and the qualifications, and being publicly financed to really be independent and qualified to hit the ground running and meet these great challenges for our state.
So not everyone really knows what the PRC does in New Mexico. So could you shed some light on that and then talk about what the commissioners do?
Sure. Well, the Public Regulation Commission is an organization, it's a regulatory organization that regulates telecommunications, motor carrier, and utility industries within the state. And it assures that utility rates are fair and reasonable, and that utility service is reliable and reasonable. So it's a big deal. Those decisions affect every single ratepayer, in our state. So it's a very, very important organization.
Okay. So why is it important that a candidate for Public Regulation Commission be publicly funded?
Well, some of the most powerful industries in our state are regulated by the PRC. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of pressure on these commissioners by lobbyists and special interests and donors. They have a big stake in the outcome of these decisions. And public financing is only offered to Supreme Court candidates, to appellate court candidates, and the Public Regulation Commission. And it gives us an opportunity to really engage in a grassroots campaign to collect all these $5 qualifying contributions. It gives me an opportunity to talk about the benefits of public financing. And when I get the allocation, it's wonderful because I don't have to worry about fundraising. And so I can be truly independent from any special interests and big donors. And, getting dark money out of politics I think it should be a priority of all of us. And I think by me being a publicly financed candidate really helps get us to that point where we can start getting this big money out of politics.
Okay. A lot of people have called for turning the PRC into an appointed body, whereas right now it's an elected body. Now, you personally support keeping it an elected body, correct?
I do.
All right. Well, why is that?
Well, first of all, we have had a public regulatory commission that has been appointed before. It was a 3-member appointed body. It was appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. And we just keep, amending our state constitution over and over again. It's like trying the same thing and hoping for a different outcome. And, I'm the great grandson of a constitutional delegate. And I think if he were alive today, he'd be wondering, you're losing the context of the entire Constitution by enacting these piecemeal amendments. So the Constitution aside, really studies have shown that states that have elected commissioners have lower rates. In fact, I've been told by one of the sitting commissioners that New Mexico has the lowest utility rates, in the country. And so I think it's important that you have an elected commissioner, because elected commissioners are strong ratepayer advocates. They're accessible to the voters and accountable to the voters. And so it's very, very, very important that who represents you on the Public Regulation Commission.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier wanting to make some improvements to the PRC. What changes are you hoping to make?
Well, the first thing is many people don't understand it's supposed to be an independent regulatory organization, but it's entirely dependent on state legislative funding. The Public Regulation Commission is nothing but a pass-through organization for funding. It brings in over $100 million, and it doesn't get to keep any of it. Most of it is the Fire Protection Fund. But here's the thing, they have to go to the Legislative Finance Committee every year to ask for funding. And what's been the consequence? They've been chronically underfunded. The funding has been unstable in the face of an ever increasing regulatory environment. And so, plus our state legislature has been enacting legislation like the Energy Transition Act, like the Grid Modernization Act, like the Transportation Electrification Act. And these all require additional resources of the PRC, but yet they're not providing the necessary resources to make those, or necessary funding to make those resources available. So they're really setting up the Public Regulation Commission to fail in a way by creating additional demands through state legislation and not providing the funding to provide the resources necessary to fully implement that legislation.
Okay. What's your take on the Energy Transition Act?
Well, look, this was passed in 2019. It's a landmark piece of legislation that sets an ultimate goal to be carbon free, to have our energy be carbon free by 2045 for investor-owned utilities and 2050 for co-ops like Kit Carson Electric Co-op. And so it sets that marker, for our state in a transition to clean energy, and it's one of the most aggressive transitions in the country. So we're really a leader in that regard. And I think what it does too is it presents an opportunity to grow the renewable energy sector, to create new jobs, diversify our economy, and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Because we've seen through this pandemic and the sudden decline in oil and gas revenues, I mean, we're in a deep, deep fiscal hole right now. And so our renewable energy sector has the potential to really diversify our economy and give us more of a stable economic base going forward.
So how does the PRC work in relation to the legislature, the courts, the executive branch, all these other entities in the state of New Mexico?
Well, as I mentioned, the PRC has to go before the Legislative Finance Committee for funding. And so that's, I think, that a primary, relationship between the PRC and the legislature. The Attorney General, many people don't realize, they have the primary consumer advocacy role for ratepayers in PRC cases. And so there is a direct relationship between the PRC and the Attorney General with regard to consumer advocacy. And obviously, there's relationships with the executive branch. A lot of these cases that come before the PRC may have environmental, public safety implications, and that's where you expect related state agencies like Energy and Minerals and New Mexico Environment Department to intervene in some of these cases. So PRC, the whole umbrella of PRC involves the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the Attorney General. And so it's a very, very important agency. And what I'd like to see is I'd like to see more cooperation. Right now, I think there's too much acrimony between the legislative and executive branches and the PRC. We all need to kind of get together and share that vision in creating that path to a clean energy future, a path that's not yet defined, in my opinion.
So what can you do as an individual commissioner to help build those stronger relationships?
Well, I have experience being a former mayor and a former city councilor. I've worked with our congressional delegation. I've traveled to Washington to work with them on improving federal programs and federal funding that would affect my constituents. I've worked with the legislature. I've gone before the legislature to directly lobby them. I've lobbied to organizations like the Water Trust Board. So I know how the system works. I know how federal legislation works, being a former federal engineer and an elected official. So I really have a keen understanding of how our state works. And that's why I, again, say that I could really hit the ground running to make a difference. But again, it's going to take cooperation, I think, from everyone right now.
So what qualities should a voter look for in a PRC commissioner?
Well, and I think, let me finish the previous question, is being one member of a governing body, you have to understand that you can't do anything alone. There is a dynamic in a governing body. As you know, Darren, you serve on the Taos Town Council, and it takes an understanding and experience of working within that dynamic to get things done. And I think that is very important, and it's, I believe, a skill that I've developed, over the last, 14 years as a local elected official. But I think the qualities, of a good public regulation commissioner, someone who knows that he's an individual and he needs to work with other commissioners to make things happen. I think a good leader is a good skill that would be good for a public regulation commissioner to lead certain efforts. There's many times where I'll lead an effort. I feel comfortable, I'm knowledgeable in it, and I feel comfortable leading it. But there are other times where other individuals on a governing body want to take the lead and I'll support that. I'll do what I can as kind of a support person. So knowing your position on a governing body, knowing when to lead, using good judgment. I think sound judgment is very important in the PRC. You want to be objective, you want to be balanced, you want to treat every single case independently and on its merits. I don't subscribe to factional politics, and I never have. I know that's been going on, maybe, or maybe that's the perception of the PRC, but I want to come in there with a clean slate, be objective, show good judgment, be a good leader, and recognize my position on that governing body, that I can't do it alone.
So recently, regarding the Energy Transition Act, the PRC was in the news because there was apparently some hesitancy by the commission to put that into effect, and specifically around the San Juan generating plant. And
Right.
the Supreme Court ended up ordering the PRC to do that. Like, I mean, where do you stand on ETA and that whole process that we just saw working its way
Look,
through?
there's no point in looking back. The Energy Transition Act of 2019 now is the law of the land. As you said, the Supreme Court mandated that the PRC apply the Energy Transition Act in the ongoing proceedings of the closure of the San Juan generating station. So that applies to the abandonment and securitization of it. That's one case. And then the other case, well, now it's a consolidated case. But another element of that case is the replacement power. The Public Regulation Commission has to approve almost 500 megawatts of replacement power, once the coal plant closes. And so this is a big job. You have closure and abandonment and payment for stranded assets, and you have replacement power. And maybe the recent decision that you're referring to is that the hearing examiners made a recommendation on part of the replacement power. It was about 410 megawatts of these two hybrid solar and battery storage projects. I read the hearing examiner's recommendations. I agreed with them. However, the PRC decided to defer and wait till they make a decision on the entire amount of the replacement power. So I disagreed with the majority of the commissioners. I would have approved the hearing examiner's recommendations. The only thing about that is the Energy Transition Act requires the ETA to be located, requires the replacement power to be located in the Consolidated Central School District to help replace its lost tax base from the closure of the coal plant. But the clause in there says up to 450 megawatts. So it can be 1 megawatt or it can be 450 megawatts. And I think the hearing examiners took a liberal interpretation and said, well, we'll just, we'll locate these outside of that school district, kind of contrary to the intent of the Energy Transition Act. But there's other considerations that need to be looked at in locating new replacement power facilities. Is it close to the grid? Is it close to existing transformers? Does it meet the standards of a convenience and necessity for the public? Is it the least cost alternative? So there's a lot of factors that went into that. And so replacement power right now, I think is very controversial. On the abandonment and securitization, the hearing examiners have already made a recommendation to approve the financing order of the abandonment, to fund the abandonment and stranded costs of the power plant. So I think that decision is going to be made in next month, as I understand. So it's moving forward. There was some hiccups in replacement power, but the ETA is being applied and progress is being made, albeit maybe a little slow.
Okay, thank you. I think this crisis has really laid bare the paucity of infrastructure in our state. We're seeing workers and children having to adapt to life at home and work from home and study from home in a state that really doesn't have a lot of internet access in all areas. And then, I mean, even at a more basal level, like in the Navajo Nation, we see a lack of running water and so many other resources. What is the role, if any, in the PRC in helping to improve infrastructure statewide?
Well, first of all, the Public Regulation Commission really needs to be aware of this. As I mentioned before, right now, I think people out there are safe. There's a mandate not to disconnect their utilities under this emergency order by the governor, but what happens when the order is lifted? They're going to have very high utility bills. And so we all need to work together to see how we can help these people pay these utility bills off, or even get some kind of a subsidized waiver on some of those delinquent bills. The Public Regulation Commission needs to be aware of equity, of fairness. We have to make sure that residents, especially rural residents, don't pay a disproportionate high share of this transition to a clean energy future. And so you're right, this pandemic has really exposed those inequities between the haves and the have-nots. And it's time for us to really face this, because if we don't, our middle class is going to be eliminated. And so we need to be more targeted in our infrastructure investment decisions and identify those areas that don't have rural broadband. We have a rural broadband program. About $5 million is invested, which is part of the New Mexico Rural Universal Service Fund, but we need more investment in that. And we need to address, again, as you said, these gross inequities, because it's just not fair. It's not fair. We're going to see businesses fail. We're going to see people, be homeless. I mean, this could be, a very slow decline, of our population, especially in rural areas. And I think that you need a public regulation commissioner that is going to show compassion and objectivity in helping to solve these problems with respect to utilities, connections, and delinquent utility bills and infrastructure investment.
Thank you. Normally with a couple weeks to go before election day, candidates would be hitting the streets, knocking on doors, wearing through their shoes. You can't do that right now. Obviously, it's not the safest way to campaign. So what are you doing to get the word out?
Well, as you said, it's going to take candidates to really pivot and adapt. And I think that's what I've been doing. My campaign, it's a grassroots, people-powered campaign. As I mentioned, it's 100% publicly financed. But what we're doing is we're using digital advertising a lot more. I would say more digital advertising and not so much mail literature. But the other thing is we have created a massive virtual phone bank, and we're getting down to the grassroots and contacting people in their homes. I realize that, they're probably getting slammed with a lot of candidates calling them, but of the opportunities that I do get to contact voters and discuss some of the issues, it's fantastic. It's just like you're talking to them across their kitchen table. It's the next best thing. And so there still is a grassroots element to campaigning in these pandemic times, but I think it takes adaptation, and that's what we're doing.
How can someone find out more information about your campaign?
Yeah, I invite voters of Taos County to find out more about myself, my campaign, and if they want to get involved. I have a website. It's Maestas 4, the number 4, NM, N as in Nancy, M as in Mary.com, maestas4nm.com. If they want to email me, they can email me directly at maestas4, the number 4, N as in Nancy, M as in Mary @gmail.com.
Okay, thank you. And any closing statements or words for the voters in Taos County?
Yes, I mean, these are trying times, and I know that it may be difficult to focus on this election, but I urge everyone to vote and participate and make your voice heard. I urge you to vote by absentee ballot to stay safe. And I urge you to vote for me, Joseph Maestas, for the Public Regulation Commission as the most experienced, the most qualified, and the best leader for this office. And I want to close by saying that it's an honor to serve and help people. It's one thing to campaign, it's another to govern. And when I govern, it's so nice to work with people and help people, because it's gratifying to do that. I want to close by saying I was just endorsed by the Santa Fe New Mexican, and I've been endorsed by a lot of elected officials in northern New Mexico, including unions like the Central Labor Council. But I would be honored to have your vote, Joseph Maestas, for Public Regulation Commission in District 3. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Joseph Maestas, candidate for Public Regulation Commission, District 3. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with Taos County Democratic Party today, and be safe, wear a mask, stay home as much as possible, and wash your hands. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.